Hi, everyone. Thank you very much for joining us today for our webinar titled Foresight is 2020, Understanding Physical Risk and a Climate Impacted Future. I'm Verena Radulovich, our Vice President for Business Engagement at the Center for Climate and Energy Solutions, also known as C2ES. C2ES is a nonpartisan, nonprofit research organization committed to advancing climate solutions and the technologies and policies to promote them. We advance business support for climate action through our Business Environmental Leadership Council, which is a group of 40 Fortune 500 companies that are committed to addressing climate change through reducing their emissions and making investments in low carbon technologies. But we also bring together stakeholders of different perspectives and sectors to build common ground for ambitious climate policy. Over the last 7 years, C2ES has been examining the intersection of climate change and its risks to our economy, risks that are felt by localities alike and companies. And when we think about companies, especially in their supply chains. Last week, C2ES released a report titled Emerging Practices in Tcfd Aligned Climate Risk and Opportunity Analysis and Disclosure. And this report looks at how companies are measuring, assessing, addressing, and reporting these risks and their opportunities, which is timely given that many of us have heard that the SEC is coming out with its, well, they're voting on March 21st, but the idea is to vote on a proposed rule that will require companies to disclose their climate-related financial risks. While our report looks at both the physical and transition risks, in today's webinar, we will focus on how to develop an understanding of one's physical risks from climate change. For those of you that may have missed it, last week on March 9th, we had an interview with BHP and the TCFD Secretariat looking at transition risks, so go ahead and check that out. But today, we're going to have a rich discussion on what it means to look at the physical risks from climate change. And with that, I will now turn it to my colleague, Laura Brush, who is C2ES's Resilience Fellow, to take it from here.
Thanks, Verena, and hi, everyone. It's great to be here today. So I'll first talk a bit more about our recent report and a toolkit that we've just published, and then we'll turn to our excellent panelists and discussion with them. There will be an opportunity for Q&A from the audience, and excuse me, the webinar will be available on C2ES's YouTube page within about 24 hours. So as Verena mentioned, C2ES's new report in part examines how companies are measuring and assessing their physical risks to the increasingly severe extreme weather events being brought on by climate change. We discuss how companies are identifying relevant risks and opportunities and measuring their actual and potential exposure to climate hazards, often using interpreted climate data available from third-party analytics providers that process and categorize this data using proprietary methods. Companies turn to these providers often because using raw, unprocessed climate data requires a high level of expertise that companies don't often have in-house. So we found that there are several challenges to measuring physical climate risk, including a lack of standardization and guidance in data and scenario selection, a lack of sector-specific guidance on what data to actually apply, inconsistent data availability and scales, and the fact, again, that data comprehension and translation requires significant expertise. So these challenges are not dissimilar from the barriers that local and state leaders face in assessing physical climate risks, which C2ES explores through our work on local climate resilience. We have found that, like private sector stakeholders, local government leaders often face barriers to assessing their physical risks related to climate change. It can be difficult to find the right climate information, know how to use it, apply it to a local area to get really a full picture of the risk that a community will face in the future under different possible climate change scenarios. So we at C2ES have been really pleased to see recent action from the federal government that aims to improve the quality and usability of its climate information that is accessible to local decision makers and the public. We also see opportunities for the federal government to continue to expand its support for companies in undergoing climate risk assessment and create tools and information that are specific to the needs of the private sector. So to supplement our report, C2ES has compiled an interim physical risk toolkit, which you'll see as we share our screen here. Hopefully it'll come through. Let me just exit out of here real quick. This resource is designed to assist companies in taking basically what we see as the first step in navigating the ever expanding list of publicly available tools and data. It's basically a compilation of resources that can help companies understand what types of data and information providers are available. And we assembled this toolkit with feedback from companies that we engaged through the research that I mentioned on which tools they use and which have been helpful in their risk assessment processes. So the toolkit primarily includes resources covering data for the US that are from publicly available sources, including the federal government and academia. We've also included several resources from private organizations that are well used by both private and public stakeholders. You can see on the screen here the list of resources in the center, as well as several filters you can use to find the type of information you're looking for. So from temporal scale, whether the data is historical or future looking, geographic coverage, basically how downscaled the data is. You can search on a specific hazard or topic. So for example, rainfall or sea level rise or land elevation. And you can also search on the level of difficulty of the data or tool, and if it includes data visualizations like maps or charts that can be helpful in interpreting it. And you'll also see at the top that there's a button for a downloadable version of the spreadsheet. That includes the resources we have here on this webpage, as well as a list of organizations and providers of climate information and analytics, as well as definitions for key terms that are commonly used in the physical climate risk assessment process. So we think that as the availability, analysis, and accessibility of climate data continues to evolve, that more resources like this one will likely become available to further help companies. But for now, and for those watching who are interested in learning more about this process or beginning this process for your organization, we hope you'll check out the tool and that it's useful for you in giving you a better understanding of climate data resources that are available. So with that, I would like to turn to our three speakers for today. They're each coming at this topic in different ways, but we'll hear from each of them about how their companies and organizations are assessing forward-looking physical risks from a changing climate and developing resources to assist companies and investors. So first we'll have Don Bain. Don is Senior Advisor at Climate Central. Next, we'll hear from Carlos Sanchez. Carlos is Executive Director of the Coalition for Climate Resilient Investment. And finally, we'll hear from Jill Blixstein, Managing Director and Head of ESG at American Airlines. We will start with presentations from each of our speakers and then have about 25 minutes for questions at the end, including from the audience. So please submit your questions on Zoom. And I will now turn it to Don.
Good afternoon. Welcome and thank you for taking the time to join us. So I'm Don Bain. I'm a engineer with a company called Climate Central. Next slide, please. We are a climate science research and communications firm. We're a nonprofit founded in 2008. We're 40 people, mostly scientists, engineers, meteorologists, etc. Usually at Princeton in non-COVID times. As you probably know, Princeton is a community of practice, one of the best in the world with regard to climate science. We're nonpartisan, non-political, technology and policy neutral. We don't advocate or lobby or campaign, etc. We are practitioners of climate science. We participate, which means practically that we have about a 2-year lead before things get published in the peer-reviewed literature that helps us stay out front. Next slide, please. Most often you'll find us, if you watch American television, you'll see us in the weathercast. Almost all the stations in the United States use our material. They receive our material once a week and include it in their broadcast. I characterize this like the old Intel Inside campaign. You may recall the stickers you would find on computers that said there were Intel chips inside the computers that were sold by many different companies. Well, we're Climate Central, and we're inside of the broadcast and a lot of information sources that are creating their own branded climate information. Next slide, please. Another example of that is this screen. This is a full-size wall display put up by Standard & Poor's at the most recent international climate conference called COP that took place in Scotland this fall. That map is a map of assets. These happen to be a view to real estate assets that Standard & Poor's is tracking. And they use Climate Central data for the sea level rise component of the climate hazards. Many financial services companies do as well. So you'll find Climate Central data inside many other companies' products as well. Next slide, please. By now, you know we have a problem, and that is that we've gotten very, very good at digging up carbon and putting it up into the atmosphere, up into our climate and our life support system. And in fact, almost more than half of it has been put up in the last 30 years, which it was in the lifetime of everybody on this webinar. So it's a big deal. We're, as I said, we're very good at it, and we're very good at accounting for it as well. Next slide, please. Nowhere is it more visible, the consequences of climate change, than in the rising waters that are occurring every day all around the world, but also in this country. And even though you may not realize it, almost every day flooding is occurring somewhere that didn't happen before. And it's happening more and more frequently in more and more places. So here's a view in Miami of a hipster in his BMW and a cowboy in his pickup truck on a sunny day driving through seawater. And driving, as you know, driving your car through seawater is not a good idea. Next slide, please. So if we are going to be able to characterize and quantify the impact of sea level rise, we need to know three things. We need to know how high is the sea, how high are the storms that happen on top of the sea, and how high or how low is the land. Next slide, please. To give you an idea, let's set a little context. This is a graph from NOAA. Those are years along the bottom axis from 1800 to 2100. Before 1900, sea level rise was stable, sea level rather, was stable for the last 5,000 years, which happened to be the time when civilization developed. We started writing down history, et cetera, making TikTok, happen, et cetera. Anyway, we could be excused for thinking that it was stable and constant. Long about 1900, however, it started rising. I say it shifted into first gear. And then about 1992, it shifted into second gear. And just after the turn of this century, it's gone to third gear. And it's about to take off dramatically. So how do we know? With regard to the past, we have observations for hundreds of years and can construct sea levels well into history. For the future, we use models. And we use models that are derived from climate models. And climate models now are well developed, well understood, and very, very good when it comes to some variables, especially temperature. And our sea level rise models, the components that have to do with the consequences of temperature, are also very, very good at this point. So they tell us what will happen with the fundamental physics of our planet and the consequences of that carbon pollution that I showed you a moment ago. So why do we have these different lines going forward? That's because the models can't tell us one thing, and that is they can't tell us what humans decide to do in the future. And so which pathway we find ourselves on depends very much on the behaviors, the policies, the actions that we as humans take. Next slide, please. I took the liberty of placing that graph I showed you before, the carbon pollution, on the same time scale as the sea level rise models. And a couple of things jump out. First, they have the same shape. And secondly, there's this big lag. And The reason for that lag is because we're actually changing in very slight amounts the temperature of a planet. And that takes time. So I liken this in real life to that friend or family member that has a few too many drinks, goes on Amazon and starts buying stuff. Well, it takes a while for that stuff to show up. And with regard to sea level rise, we've been buying a lot, and most of it is going to get delivered later this century. Next slide, please. So I'll let you read this while I introduce it. Our friends at NOAA, and they really are friends, both personal and professional, are some of the finest climate and sea level rise scientists in the world. They published a report 2 weeks ago on the current state of sea level rise for the United States. This is a precursor to the next national climate assessment, which will probably be out within the next year. But here's what they said. Next slide, please. 2 feet of sea level rise along the US coast is increasingly likely between now and the end of the century. So that's that black line, that black arrow I've drawn on the graph. And that is because of emissions to date. So going back to my Amazon analogy, that's the stuff that we've already bought that is going to be delivered. It's going to at least give us that much by the end of the century, even if we were magically able to clean up our act going forward. Now, there's some small vertical bars on the right. Those are bars that have to do with the climate models and the emissions projections associated with potential human behavior. You'll notice the black arrow falls right in the middle of that orange one, which is again to say our models are very good at this point. Next slide, please. If we fail, and this is again NOAA's words, failing to curb future emissions could cause a total of 3.5 to 7 feet. So those are those 2 black lines at 3.5 feet or 7 feet, and those have to do with what could happen if we don't get our act together. Now, one thing to think about here is what we choose with regard to the future determines which of these curves we get on. We have the hope, and at this point it's only a hope, that we will stay on those lower curves and that we will have the capacity to adapt our cities in time. If we get on the higher curves, then we're going to severely stress our cities, especially the ones that don't have the resources of, say, Manhattan, to be able to keep up with this, move people, move their infrastructure, etc. So this is a major endeavor for all of us, for the public, and for the corporations that we're all trying to serve through this effort. Next slide, please. So I've talked a little bit about the models, which is how we address the first 2 questions. The third question is also very important, and it's somewhat non-obvious. So I want to spend just a moment with us and with that. And so that's the question of how high or how low is the land. Next slide, please. We have released a product called Coastal DEM, which is a digital elevation model that provides for elevation data in most areas of the world. Next slide, please. Now, all of these elevation models for the world outside of the US are derived from satellites. This is the most recent one. The most recent one is based on laser technology. The prior ones were based on radar technology, and they all have a problem. Next slide, please. The problem is shown shown in this graph. It's not rendering yet on my system. There it comes. So this graph, these are the 5 major elevation models. 4 of them have this large bar these are in meters. Those run from about 1.5 meters to 2.5 meters. So something on the order of 5 feet to 7 or 8 feet of error. And what this means is that the elevation that we thought were the coastlines of the world were overstated by about the height of a human being. And the reason for that is we're sensing elevations from space, and the space-based measurement systems have a hard time discerning between the tops of buildings and the tops of trees and the ground. Well, Climate Central recognized this problem and has solved it through combining a bunch of other data sets using AI technology to reduce that error to almost nothing, which is the green circle on the left here. The reason that's important is it gives us a truer evaluation of what's at risk, and the difference between these means ultimately hundreds of millions of people and billions of dollars worth of infrastructure whose risk was not properly calculated as a result of not knowing how high, or in this case, how low the ground is. Next slide, please. So I'd like to share my screen now and take you to where we make these tools, these models, and this elevation technology available to everyone. Stand by while I do my share. Here we go. So if you were to go to coastal.climatecentral.org, and I encourage you all to write that URL down, coastal.climatecentral.org, you'll find this page where you can see our screening tools and choose a map. And I encourage you to choose a map for the year. I've already done that here. It brings up a page which shows on the right side, it shows a map of whatever location you put in the location search box. I put in Charleston, South Carolina for this particular example. And everything on this side of the screen is Google Maps technology. So you should be very familiar with it. Almost everybody has used it. It has the ability to zoom and pan and do all the other things that Google Maps does. And you can find your house or your McDonald's or the boss's house, etc. This is Charleston, South Carolina. This happens to be where I've got my cursor is the VA hospital, which I'm showing as an island. And it's an island in this area of red. Red is where future water levels are anticipated to be given certain scenarios or assumptions. In this case, this slider allows us to change the year and make another assumption and show us how any particular place on Earth might look given these assumptions. If you were to go to other settings, you can choose the various sea level rise models and choices about humans' future behavior with regard to emissions and see what is at risk and what might happen. So right now I'm showing you what humans are currently on track to do, which is what I showed you in those earlier graphs. Philip, you could go back to the slide share now. See if I can stop my share. There we go. If you could go back to my slides. And let's advance too. So the map view has all of this technology that I described earlier, but many of the companies that we work with came to us and said, you know, maps are great, but they're not very convenient. We'd like a way to understand the potential consequences and risks to our homes, to our mortgages, to our insurance policies, to our book of business in whatever field. And as a response to that, we've created the ability to upload a spreadsheet with locations, latitude and longitude of locations that, as I said, could be insurance policies, new homes, etc. Next slide, please. There are also industrial facilities, supply chain assets, ports, roads, rails, etc. Basically, we can drop a pin on any location in the world, in a coastal location in the world, and quantify the risk associated with rising waters at that location. Next slide, please. And in doing so, we're uploading a spreadsheet with locations, latitude and longitudes, and we're getting back quantitative information about the expected floods to happen under future scenarios. Each of these columns with the red, yellow, and white are quantitative expected flood events across years that range from 2020, 2030, 40, 50, out to year 2100. As I said, we do this for thousands, tens of thousands of locations at a time. Next slide, please. In the context of what we're doing with the Tcfd physical risk, companies are coming to us, bringing their data about loans, supply chain, etc., and asking us to help them quantify this risk. I have two quick examples for you. A recent telecommunications client came to us with 250,000 locations around the world. They dropped those locations into these tools, quantified the risk, and found 250 of which are under significant risk throughout this the rest of this century. And while that's important from a disclosure basis, it was also, and perhaps more important, for the management team, because they found the places that mattered for which they could focus their attention. And they also discovered that 250 was a number that they could manage and bring into their operations. The second example is with one of our data partners, AccuWeather for Business. They were working with a telecommunications team looking at temperature and how that affected the copper transmission lines for their telecommunications. At a certain temperature, the insulation fails. And as a result of what they were doing for TCFD, they were able to reorient their future replacement of copper with optical fiber. Both of these are examples of bringing disclosure information out of a compliance matter and bringing it into operational activities for the companies, which we encourage and want to see more of. And my last slide is my and my colleagues' email address. You'll get copies of these slides. I encourage you to reach out if you have questions or want to know more about anything we've discussed. Thanks, Philip. I'll turn it back to you.
Thanks, Don, so much for giving us an overview of sort of the state of climate data and climate projections and the types of tools that Climate Central is providing to help interpret it. So we will now turn to Carlos Sanchez from the Coalition for Climate Resilient Investment.
Laura, thank you so much, and thank you everyone for being with us today and for the opportunity to present on CCRI. I will proceed with sharing my screen, and I'm hoping that will go smoothly. So, and I believe that is being successful now. So, I'm Carlos Sanchez. I'm the Executive Director of the Coalition for Climate Resilient Investment. And I'm going to be, of course, focusing very much in explaining what the coalition is about. Where do we come from, where we are, and where we are going to. I'm formally a Willis Stars Watson colleague, where I'm the Senior Director for Climate Resilient Investment. And as you may know, WTW is a risk advisory firm covering from insurance to investment advisory. And my role there is to really bring the wealth of analytics understanding at the science level into asset valuation and investment advisory. What happens is that I've been now 2 years exclusively dedicated to the work of the coalition. Let me go into next slide and just very briefly and very basically to give you a sense of what I would love to cover and share with all of you. First of all, what is CCRI? But then from there, very much diving into the two different cases that we have for action. We have the case for public action, why and how can governments take action, and the case for private action, and how and why private companies, but often the kind of the private sector back is considered into more of a general sense when there are so many diverse realities underneath that. So the coalition is pretty much focused on institutional investors and the call for action in that regard. And I would love to finish with a touch on the moment of truth of this coalition, that is mobilizing real capital for resilience. So let's start that, and let me start with the justification and the theory of change, because we just heard from Don an absolutely excellent presentation that I will shamelessly piggyback from, because it was excellent at the scientific level, at giving us the physics story. What is the challenge in that, and how science is really improving in a way that whereas before uncertainty was maybe a legitimate excuse for not taking action, right now uncertainty, despite existing, is not an excuse anymore. The science is very, very contundent and robust in what is coming. But still, when it comes to making decisions, what we struggle is to understand how the exposure to a certain hazard, be it acute or chronic, so acute extreme weather events and chronic changes in weather patterns, are going to evolve in critical time horizons. So let's say years 0, 5, 10, 15, and 20. We struggle to have a consistent view of that from a hazard exposure standpoint. From there, we struggle to interpret that in a financial materiality standpoint, and that is very different if it is for governments or if it is for investors. But that notion of financial materiality against an amount of dollar today, so the time value of money theory, is a struggle. And as a result of all of that, so let's call it the physics story and the financial materiality story, then we have incentive structures that struggle to be fully efficient in both incentivizing and enforcing what the right integration of physical climate risk needs to be. What we are doing in the coalition is to consider this evaluation risk. So for investors that they are holding a portfolio and those assets or securities contained within that portfolio may not be properly priced based on the real extent of physical climate risk in the future. So on the flip side, there is an opportunity. There is an opportunity for decisions to be done in the right way, considering the future state of the world, so that valuation, if not today, in a short future, in an immediate future, will be better recognized. And Verena provided us with an excellent outlook in terms of what is happening in the regulatory space in the US. And by no means I'm an expert in that area and region, but certainly we see that happening at a global level. So investors are really interested in let's call it the arbitrage opportunity that comes with that. In sum, what we are doing is trying to contribute to changing the narrative about what resilient investments are. So instead of saying, resilient investment is just a more costly, a more tedious, more process-based decision, in which, let's be honest, no rational investor would engage. What we're seeing is that we're transitioning towards resilient being the better investments. Is the better way, because for an efficient increase at the early beginning, we see a benefit in the long run. I really liked something that, well, many things that Don said, but there was a particular point about how we are locked into a certain level of impacts, and I would love to have a chat with him about what is the precise time horizon for that. It seems that it's around 12 to 15 years that, independent of our decisions today on climate mitigation, we are locked into physical climate risks impacts. Um, Having worked in the resilient investment space for a few years, I have realized that there is a very legitimate criticism to this space, and that is that we seem to portray any future state of the world as being potentially resilient. So in a way, the message being, don't worry, you just need to make the right decisions today and it'll be fine. And that is really, really far from truth. And we are making huge efforts to clarify that. What we are doing is saying that in a future state of the world where we still will need resilience, but combined with very ambitious mitigation efforts, you can be resilient, you can be profitable, and you can make returns. There are certain future states of the world in which there is no J curve, there is no net present value that will work, as I think that Don illustrated very powerfully. Um, from here, let me just touch very quickly on the vision and mission. So in terms of the vision, we want that investment decision making across regions and sectors is fully efficient in integrating physical climate risks, and with that protecting economic, ecosystemic, and financial value. In other words, our vision is to eliminate the word resilient investment in the future, because all investments, all decisions will be resilient. In terms of our mission is to really promote collaboration across sectors, in industries and peers in delivering a public good, high quality solutions that reward a more efficient decision making in terms of integrating physical climate risk. And we are really proud and happy that we are really moving towards that stage. So in this slide, what you have is very much our work plan. So what are the solutions that we are delivering, let's say, for free for the market, for governments and for investors and companies, for them to make better decisions when it comes to physical climate risks. And again, here it's crucial to dissect what are the drivers for action for a government from those from a company. And we just need to recognize that for an investor, for a company, it is about prominently, it's about serving shareholders, it's about providing financial value. Of course, there are many other considerations, ethical, moral considerations that are absolutely crucial to them, but at the core of their mandate lies that responsibility to generate risk-adjusted returns and profit. From a government perspective, though, the drivers for action is to really generate socioeconomic and ecosystem value in a given time horizon. So we really tailored solutions to these two very differentiated buckets. I should say, of course, that as of today, we have 126 members that represent 25 trillion and that are proving to be incredibly committed and collaborating in the most, I would say, amazing way towards the development of these solutions. Let me touch very quickly on those solutions for governments, and then I will move quickly to those for companies and private investors. So when we started framing what governments need, we realized that we need to facilitate two crucial activities. One is the assessment of national value at risk, and the second is the management of that risk. Uh, and that we need that the assessment and the management are very much connected and speaking to each other. And I will explain why very quickly. So in that regard, we are developing two solutions: a systemic resilience metric, so a metric that provides a measurement of national value at risk, and that is composed of economic, social, ecosystemic value. So we don't want to skew this discussion towards entirely and only GDP at risk, but certainly there's going to be a very important component of that. And then what we are finalizing indeed is a national investment prioritization tool. So it's a tool that tells a government what are the most efficient ways to allocate fiscal capacity to protect socioeconomic and ecosystem value in that country, and most crucially, in a given time horizon. two elements of connectivity here that are absolutely crucial. We need that the government that follows that list of prioritized investments sees that immediately and proportionally reflected in the systemic resilience metric. And that is to really generate what in conversations with governments we have coined as the political return on resilience. And that is that governments have many decisions, limited fiscal capacity, and what they need is to see an immediate reward, an immediate recognition for their actions instead of having to wait 15, 20 years for another administration to take credit for that resilient infrastructure. The second is that the systemic resilience metric needs to speak to sovereign credit quality, and that's no need to be a replacement or an absolute corrector, but it needs to be a proxy, even if partially, to credit quality, sovereign credit quality. Uh, Here, I would like to show you a basic representation of what we are delivering with the government of Jamaica. So this is a national investment prioritization tool with the University of Oxford, where the user, in this case, the Ministry of Finance, will adjust certain parameters in the tool. It's a longer list than the one that you see here, but just for presentation purposes, this really fits the bill. But selection of an infrastructure network, selection of a time horizon, selection of the granularity or the resolution, and then in terms of the one second, yes, vale, and then from there we will have a representation that is a visual and dynamic representation of that exposure, and from there that list of top 25 projects that will provide the most economic and social value. Then from here, let me quickly go into the asset level. So this is a totally different discussion. This is about, we look at one investment in one fixed asset, and then we are trying to understand what are the right levels of investment and cash flow modeling integration that will facilitate the right level of resilience for the asset. So for this, we have counted on the collaboration of more than 30 institutions that I'm going to be showing to you. And we've been working on 5 real investments from which we have obtained full cash flow models, full engineering studies, and then work with 7 climate risk data providers that they have worked on a pro bono basis to support this exercise. 3 key solutions have come out of this. The PCRAM, that is the Physical Climate Risk Assessment Methodology, that really, and I will go into detail in just a moment, allows you to go in taking a cash flow model and interpret how CapEx, OpEx, depreciation levels are appropriate to that level of exposure. Second, with S&P Global, and Don, I think that I was very glad to see the picture of your of that wonderful screen at COP. We also collaborate with S&P Global in an art exhibition at COP, where I will be showing you a screen where it was also about climate risk data translated into art by the artist Refik Anadol. But just as an aside, I will go back to that in a bit. But with S&P Global, they've been a very crucial supporter. They have provided an assessment or a simulation of credit quality impact associated to this work, and the conclusions are quite promising in that it establishes that PCRAM provides the best possible way to improve a simulated credit quality calculation for an asset. So we can understand the incredible potential associated to a statement of that nature. And then what we are doing is translating all of this for the purpose of the day-to-day job of an investment analyst. So we are developing investment principles for resilience. Very quickly, and please, Philip, Laura, you can stop me. I don't want to steal time from Jill. But this is the PCRAM, and maybe I'll go very quickly in terms of what the PCRAM are, what are the stages. So first of all, PCRAM establishes is the data is sufficient. So data is financial data, cash flow models, data is engineering data, and data is climate data. Once we establish that is sufficient, then there is a materiality assessment. And then the materiality thresholds really need to be established in coordination with the asset owner. But if there is a materiality case, then the methodology develops a menu of resilience options, which basically establishes different single actions with a cost associated to them that will have a potential likely impact in protecting cash flows. Because at the end of the day, this is about the resilience of cash flows. And then from there, we go into an NPV, IRR, sensitivity analysis. These are the wonderful companies that have participated in this. I mean, this is just a sub-selection of the wonderful 126 partners in the coalition. These are the companies that are working in this specific working group, but I could name a few that they have contributed with 11 colleagues, 7 colleagues, 5 colleagues over a year and a half period. So really, really committed and very solid contribution. And then from here, we really go to the next stage, and we are delighted that we are already there, and that is to pilot these solutions with real investment. And we are starting with these 3 investment facilities in Asia, Africa, and Latin America, where basically there will be investment vehicles, investment funds that will integrate CCRI solutions for the origination, the screening, and the evaluation of individual transactions. So we are quite confident that we're going to present a considerable amount of capital mobilized by COP27. I'm going to finish by just showing you a little bit of a momentum or key items or milestones. Don alluded, of course, to the IPCC report, which really brings a very concerning message, as we all know. We're delighted to be referred to within the report as one of the key resilient initiatives. A few reports that we have advanced, one about the PCRAM, but one more about the risk and resilience, or what is the motivation and genesis of CCRI. We were delighted to be part of Governor Newsom climate risk related advisory group that put forward a set of recommendations where PCRAM and CCRI were featured, and we were very thankful for that. At COP, we were delighted to be part of key sessions where CCRI was put forward as in its deliverables, really supporting a step forward in this discussion. Here is the art installation actually that I was referring to DOM, where S&P Global, along with a few other partners such as Jupiter Intelligence, Mott MacDonald, and the Atlantic Council were very generous to support this art installation. And we've been delighted to be part of the G7 and G20 processes. The Secretary General really supported the process, and I will finish with this, which is quite an indicative, and we are very proud, is that there's been just the launch of the CFA UK new certificate in climate and investing, and actually there are a few questions that touch on the work of CCRI. So with that, and not without thanking you all again, I will stop. And I will let Jill come in. But in the meantime, Laura, back to you. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Carlos, so much for describing how CCRI is really helping advance solutions for incorporating physical climate risk into decision for key assets, whether they be owned by the public sector or the private sector. So next and last but not least, we will turn to Jill Blixstein from American Airlines. Thanks, Jill.
Thanks, Laura. Can you hear me okay?
Yes.
Okay, great. So I'm here to give the perspective of the user. We are a member, American Airlines is a happy member of the Business Environment Leadership Council, and we were delighted to participate in helping in the little way that we could in the crafting of that report. And I was reflecting as I was listening to those fantastic presentations we just heard. I was just reflecting on I wish that I had been sort of better prepared, I think, as I entered our own TCFD journey. You know, I recommend to everybody that you read the new C2ES report. It's got a lot of great information, and it really does talk about this whole, the idea of engaging in TCFD is really being a journey. And there is a way to start small and expand. And really, and I think I've shared this before with the C2S folks, that it's a great opportunity to really engage your leaders across your business and help people kind of understand what these risks are and opportunities, and help them understand how we need to be positioning ourselves as a responsible company as we enter, you know, what was really, as Don said, this very challenging time for climate. So in 2019, we've always put out a corporate responsibility report. We were looking at kind of making a step change in that, and that's when Larry Fink's, he's the CEO of BlackRock, his letter came out and said everybody needs to start reporting on TCFD. And I knew a little bit about TCFD, but it quickly became clear that, you know, not just BlackRock, but really every investor is going to want to see corporate issuers doing a TCFD analysis, and maybe even. We'll see in a couple of days. We're all waiting to see what the SEC is going to require, but they may require some form of TCFD as well. We started with a qualitative assessment. I wasn't ready to really take on the quantitative assessment yet. We started that. That's available in our 2019-2020 report. And Philip, if you could just share the link to that report. So that's got a really in-depth description of both our transition risk and our physical risk. And we immediately, of course, hired a consultant. And this is one of the things that I think there's sort of this tension when you go into the TCFD processes. On the one hand, you have to go get expert advice because it's complicated. I think one day you can see kind of where the work is going. And the toolkit that Laura shared initially, you can see where this is going, is that it's going to become more accessible, but it's not super accessible right now. So we work with a climate-focused engineering firm that has a very strong TCFD practice. They're actually the same engineering firm that contributed to the report, and they got us on this pathway. So at first, you can tell from how I talk about it, I found it quite daunting. We're obviously a business that thinks a lot about weather. I'm certainly on a near term, like a daily and this week and tomorrow basis, and on a seasonal basis, but this is a much longer time frame, right? We're asking people to think 15, 30, 40 years in the future. And just because of the nature of being an airline, like that's not the immediate focus is operational reliability, profitability, especially during COVID, and customer satisfaction. So the idea about thinking super long term, like everything, most of what we do is really a today, tomorrow, next week kind of thing. So this is obviously a much longer time frame. We started with our 10 largest hub airports. That was something we could kind of wrap our heads around. The vast majority, of course, which are leased. And we also started with our largest maintenance base. So Philip, if you can put up our slide, you can see, and this is only a portion of what if you go click into the link and go look at the report, you'll see the full page. But what we ended up doing was pulling together our airports and real estate teams and having a really interesting conversation about whether our airports, like the localities, are really prepared for climate risk or are thinking about climate risk. Some are, some maybe a little bit less so. And thinking about these acute and chronic risks and how they affect an airline operation, because what the goal is in doing this is, right, you could pretty easily do kind of a generic climate analysis, but you don't want to do it. That's not the point. The point is to make it as personal and particular to the business. So there's this concept. Well, anyway, so the risks as you go through, you'll see, our risks, our chronic risks are largely sea level rise, that we have lots of airports that sit on the coast and high temperatures, and our acute risks tend to focus on be concentrated in flooding and cyclonic events and the extreme temperatures. And there's a phrase in the airline business called hot and high, and hot and high is not good. And so when you have an airport that is at relatively high altitude and it gets very extreme temperatures, it presents all kinds of challenges to trying to run an airline. When an airport is very hot and high, you might need a longer runway. It's harder to take off. You might need to reduce payload. You might have to ask passengers to get off the plane. So it's really not ideal. And you have to run your operation to accommodate. And so you may need, we're doing that. There's times during the day, during the year in Phoenix and other hot and high places where you might need to adjust even today, and you can see in the future that we'll be having to adjust even more. The other thing that's interesting about temperatures is we obviously have lots of team members working outside. So it's not like, oh, okay, it's going to be really hot, but we have air conditioning. It's, oh, it's going to be really hot, and will our teams be able to operate safely? So that's just a couple of the ways in which the analysis is particular to us. We're now doing, thank you, Philip, I think you can take that down. We're now doing our quantitative analysis, and we're doing a couple hundred facilities. And just a tip for people who are thinking about doing this, you can go talk to your insurance people because they have obviously great valuation information, including revenue information that's associated with all of your properties. And we're looking forward to bringing that back to our real estate and airport teams and having a conversation about, the next level conversation about what this analysis shows. And I think for us, this is really about building the muscle to be able to do this kind of analysis. So I expect we'll have to rely on expert consultants for a while because we're just not in the climate model business and it's complicated. We want to get it right. But I think what I see is being able to develop kind of a whole group of people across the airline who have had to engage on this, have had to opine, maybe sign off. And so you start to kind of build some awareness and understanding. I frankly thought there would be a lot more kind of organ rejection as we went into this, but I think people actually like to be asked their opinion about these things and they like learning about it. So it's been a good experience. And now since we're doing the quantitative analysis, that's going to require kind of a lot more engagement internally as people try to wrap their heads around what these long-term financial risks look like. And with that, I will turn it back to Laura.
Thanks, Jill. Really appreciate your overview of user and company perspective, sort of embarking on this journey and how it's gone for you. So now I would like to invite Don and Carlos to turn their videos back on, and we can field some questions from the audience. So I think to start us off, I'd love to hear a little bit more about, we've talked about a wide variety of tools, information, data that's available. It can often be overwhelming and difficult to use. Don's organization and Carlos's organizations are working to make information more usable and accessible. And the tool that C2ES has created is trying to do the same. So I'd love to hear from each of you, from your perspective, what kind of data and information and tools you think are missing that would help companies better or at least more easily assess their physical risk. What's missing in the landscape as it stands now?
Don, do you wanna start?
No, you take that one.
Okay, thank you very much, and thank you, Laura, for the question. So look, I will leave the more technical, scientific side for Don. I wouldn't waste the time in that regard. But what I can say is that there is a desperate need for science to become actionable and for science to really answer to the questions of businesses on their daily duties, so to say. In that regard, we traditionally associate physical climate risk with more of an element of insurance, loss and damage, and the reality is it is much more than that. There is a lot of strategic value in understanding physical climate risk, but also if it is on a purely defensive basis, understanding how your markets, how the depreciation of your assets because of higher average temperature, understanding how your business model is appropriate or not for that future state of the world, consumers, producers, supply chains. There is a myriad of answers that are required from business, and I think that the toolkit that C2ES put forward is a wonderful step forward. And we are in a way agnostic in picking what are the solutions. Hence, we are working with 7 climate risk data providers, which cover from CAT modeling to more traditional climate modeling. So the range of stochastic, probabilistic, and deterministic scenario. We know that, we think that probabilistic assessments are the ones that allow you to adjust a cash flow model and work on that. But maybe just to leave my answer at a high level, what I think is that analytics are starting to allow us to inform those decisions, but there's still work to do in terms of further adjusting to the use case of a particular actor. And I will finish with giving an example of one of the interactions that we've had in terms of different assets, where first the question was, what is the thing about climate change? And tell me something. And then there was a deployment of maybe CAD modeling capabilities to see a given point in time view on exposure and vulnerability. Then the second question was, well, what is going to happen in the future? Then you try to extend that. I mean, catastrophe models are a little bit difficult to be adjusted or to be time conditioned to speak to years beyond year 5, but you can still attempt to do that. And then once you cover that, then the question is, then is that asset value the right one? So instead of starting with asset value, we ended with the asset value in recalculating what will be the commercial value of that asset given the exposure that it has. So Laura, I think I should stop. I feel I'm rambling a little bit, and I'm keen to hear also from Don, but I'll leave it there.
Thank you, Carlos. I endorse what you said. I think there are 2 things that are missing from my perspective. One is location matters now more than ever. The world has gotten more instrumented, incredibly so, and our models are getting ever better resolution. So 20 years ago, our corporations had a hard time answering how many people work for us. Today, they have a hard time answering where are all of our assets, facilities, and people geolocated. So that's challenge number 1. Challenge number 2 is actually more difficult, and that is the interconnectivity between our company and their suppliers and customers, the value chain and supply chain. So COVID has taught us the perils associated with disruptions there. Climate change is going to be a much bigger set of lessons, and we're going to have to get better at mapping those those connections so that we can properly understand the risk. Thank you, Laura.
And Laura, I would just add, I think that Don's point about the supply chain is really interesting, because that's one of the things that we're grappling with now as we're doing our quantitative analysis of this broader set of physical risks, is looking at our supply chain. And there's obviously lots of pressure on companies to understand their supply chain for lots of reasons, but the climate one in particular, and it's driving even more engagement, by companies with their supply chains directly.
Yeah, and Jill, sort of springboarding off of the work that you actually have to do to get these assessments done. Can you talk a bit more about the internal exercise you did to engage other departments on physical risk? So the chart you showed, and as you move from a qualitative to a more quantitative assessment of climate risk, what kind of internal engagement is needed?
Well, when we decided just to do the top 10 and the maintenance space, it was just a matter of really being able to work with the airport and the airports teams and the real estate teams, frankly, more the real estate teams, because they're dealing with those airports on a daily basis and they kind of understand the pressure on the business. So, we didn't do any of the climate analysis in-house, right? We had an outside firm really presenting us with results and asking for feedback. And so first, I'd been worried people weren't even able to wrap their heads around, like, okay, what does this really mean? But they can. And so that ended up being the easy part. And then the hard part is, all right, what does that really mean for the business? And how do we have to, and what do we need to do? There isn't so much of the what do we need to do now. There's how do you think about the long-term investments? And we're putting a lot of capital into our airports. We're opening new terminals all the time. I hope somebody's been to LaGuardia recently and you can see the new American terminal. But then you start to have this then you start to kind of match up this question about our capital investment and, well, is that particular asset going to be underwater? Is it going to be at risk? And in what kinds of ways from different climate risks? So it's to me, I think about it as sort of like getting climate into the water inside the company and getting people more fluent in, okay, these are the risks and this is how we have to think about it. Unfortunately, I think, at least now, I think it's still kind of a once a year check-in. It's not so much an ongoing because we have much more immediate ongoing needs, but I expect that will change. And then having done this exercise means that we've got a group of people ready to engage in the next level of exercise.
Great. And a quick question for Dawn from the audience. Can you talk about the financial indicators that Climate Central uses to quantify the financial risk to companies from physical impacts? And also, does Climate Central assess more than sea level rise?
Thank you for that. So with regard to financial indicators, those are basically something that our clients apply. So we concentrate on the physical risk and the consequences. We're glad to make the connection. And if our client gave us a particular set of, for example, asset values, we would give you another example. We're currently assessing the impact to every coastal property in the United States in terms of the acres that are expected to be flooded and the structures that will be touching floodwaters as the century unfolds. And we have the taxable values associated with those that are impacted. We don't do loss damage curves like the insurance industry. We leave that to our clients' judgment. A couple of reasons for that. One is the insurance industry is very good at insuring structures, but what is at risk is much more than structures, right? It's jobs, health, human health, safety, our cities, our economy, etc. With regard to the second question, there are many other aspects of climate that we regularly quantify for our stakeholders, including our clients. My colleague Karen Florini is online, and she manages the program that does that. I'd invite her to comment.
Thanks, and I'm going to do that by showing a couple of images of what we do very quickly. These are initially produced for media purposes rather than for you all. However, they may be useful in certain circumstances because they are good graphical representations of localized impacts. So, for example, we'll focus on trends about days above certain threshold temperatures that are locally salient. Also look at projections into the future using IPCC data. And by the way, it's not just temperature. What really turns out to matter, I'm picking up on Jill's point about her outdoor workers, is the humid heat. And that turns out to be a very significant issue in terms of labor productivity as well as health. It's going up and it's going to continue to go up a lot because for every single Celsius degree of increased heat, you get a 7% overall increase in global humidity. So there's a lot of concern about humid heat. Mostly people are thinking about agricultural workers. I hadn't previously thought about airport workers, but that's clearly a major issue in that industry. We also look at issues relating to deluge, big downpours of water and lack thereof, terms of drought. We look also at the impacts such as on fires, which we haven't had much discussion of, but that's clearly an immense and growing problem, especially in the arid western parts of the United States. When we release these, we're not just sending out the graphics, but also some context in terms of concepts as well as experts. And when we have more to say, then we'll fit into one of the weekly bulletins that I just showed you. We'll do an additional report that's in the 10-page range as well. Also looking at not additional consequences such as air quality, icky bugs, and all of this material is available through our media library, which is a bit clunky at the moment. Within the month, we expect to have a much better version of our website available. And so you can look not only by keyword, but also by locality. We have a tool called Risk Finder that is again undergoing a major overhaul that lets you look by location at population at risk and buildings and infrastructure. So those are some of the additional tools that we also have available.
Thanks, Karen, for showing. Ooh, I'm getting an echo. I think you might need to mute yourself, Karen. Thank you. Yeah, thank you so much for showing more of Climate Central's tools. And I think this dovetails well to another audience question that we got that I think all three of you could answer. Have American Airlines or CCRI faced difficulties in assessing granular climate risk in areas where relevant data, projections, or mapping is lacking? Don, they're wondering what best practices you could share for practitioners looking to assess risk in locations that have these issues. For example, Puerto Rico, where they're which is not actually covered by flood maps and sea level rise projections that aren't as accurate as in the contiguous US. And the audience member is correct in imagining that these issues are present elsewhere in the world as well. So if you could all sort of weigh in on, you know, what you do and what the process is when that granularity is really lacking.
Don, are you going to pick that one up? Don, you should go first. I'll have a small comment after.
I'll take the easy part of that. Has to do with sea level rise. So on sea level rise, we can do basically anywhere in the world south of 60 degrees north latitude, which basically is you know, everybody except a portion of Finland and Sweden, and above 56 degrees south latitude. And we can do that at a spatial resolution of 30 meters. So that's very high resolution. And we have the latest and greatest IPCC models. That is the latest and greatest sea level rise science. With regard to the climate models, the resolution's not as good, but for you know, the spatial resolution is good for many purposes with regard to temperature. Precipitation is a little more of a challenge, but it's doable. So I would say take heart. It's getting better and better. As Jill said earlier, get started. Before you're finished, the data is going to catch up and pass you. So jump in the water. It's warm, but it's fine.
And I have a non-expert answer to that question, which is when we started our most recent take on the physical risk analysis, and I was working with my consultant on which climate scenario to choose, which I always find kind of a frightening, you know, how am I supposed to know? But one of the issues was that not all the climate scenarios have been modeled down to the level of detail we would need to assess all of our assets. And maybe Don can speak to that. He probably understands what on earth I'm talking about. But it ended up having an impact, and it comes up because a lot of the outside stakeholders want everyone to choose a 1.5 degree scenario, and not. I think the 1.5 degree scenarios maybe aren't modeled to the extent we needed. So we didn't end up choosing one, but it was one of those situations where I found like the outside pressure. I kind of want to go back and say, well, I'm trying to do the right thing, but it's just not available yet. Right. And so, but Don, I'll let you correct me.
No, I do have a very strong opinion on that. And it's as follows. I did an experiment, an applied experiment with a management team. I took them through two different scenarios and asked them, what management decisions would you make as a result of the different consequences that you see? And after we went through, we found that none of the decisions would be different. In other words, that the things that they assessed that were at risk and needed to be done regardless of the scenario. So the winning move is to get started and to jump in and not get frozen by having to make a false choice about which of these scenarios might be best. Yeah, I'll leave it at that.
If I can,
Oh, sorry, go
sorry,
ahead,
Jill.
Carlos.
No, you go first, Jill.
No, I was just going to say that in the C2S report, there's this great comment about false precision. And I think, you know, to Don's point, you can get all wrapped around the axle around some of these decisions. And in the end, they might not actually matter. But go ahead, Carlos.
Thank you, Jill. And look, very briefly, just to add to what Don and Jill just shared, in the context of CCRI, we've been working in certain jurisdictions in Africa, in the Caribbean, but also more in OECD jurisdictions. And we have faced this incredible challenge of data quality and analytical approaches, because we combine within the climate risk data providers. As I said, we have CAT modelers, then we have climate modelers, then we have more of like a earth observation firms. And what we are finding is that there is an Don may hit the term, but there is a sweet spot in combining, in getting a little bit of probabilistic, a little bit of deterministic, and where data is not ideal, to really start from somewhere. And I think that's something that the three of us agree. You need to start with something, because something is better than nothing, and then it's going to allow you to start getting the ball rolling. So I said at the beginning, we at CCRI we feel that whereas in the past it was a justifiable excuse to say that uncertainty was too much, and now that is not the case. And there are means to get the discussion started, whatever the location or whatever the hazard. I leave it there.
Great. And I now have two policy-oriented questions for Jill and Carlos, since you both engage with policy in your respective roles. I wanted to know first, what do you think is the most important action that the federal government should take to help companies in the process of assessing physical risks?
Jill, I let you go first.
Okay. I think the government could adopt some of these models and toolkits and make them available, endorse them and make them available to lots more people. I think they can provide some guidance on, and maybe safe harbor on like what's what's the right kind of approach to take. They probably can provide some guidelines on what kind of assurance you need to get. I mean, I think there's going to be, this SEC rule is going to be really interesting in the sense of what kind of guardrails do they put out, what do they require, but also what kind of guidance do they provide. So I think in the same way that the EPA has shared, all these a very helpful toolkit of factors for Scope 3 emissions, I think that they can endorse more tools and put out more tools so that people can get started on this journey.
Thank you, Jill. And so I will add a couple of comments, but they will be very, let's say, narrow to the infrastructure space and very much in relation to the infrastructure bill passed last year. And there is a huge step forward with regard to the integration of physical climate risk in the planning considerations and infrastructure aspects in the US at the federal level. There's still potential to make a very clear connection between upstream planning and downstream, and to enhance the prioritization of infrastructure planning based on the envisaged protection of economic, social, and ecosystem value in the country. Also to recognize how, let's call it the infrastructure of the future, is also gonna play an important role in also being in also providing a lot of resilience to the system. And then of course with all of these, and a little bit of a self-serving with regard to CCRI, but to really enable and promote a better connectivity between private and public capital to make those resilient assets possible. Because at the end of the day, a resilient infrastructure asset is not a binary choice of the asset does not exist or exists and then it's resilient. It's a qualitative. That asset needs to be born with the attributes, and those attributes means that it may be a delta capex of a few basis points, but we need to really encourage and incentivize that infrastructure of the future becomes a reality with the right attributes to withstand the future state of the world. But I will leave it with that.
Great, thank you. Yeah, and it's about empowering both private and public sector stakeholders who either build or maintain or rely on this infrastructure to understand the futures that we need to be preparing it for, so that it can continue to be reliable. Jill, you mentioned the pending SEC rule, and we have an audience question. What do you think such a rule will mean for the private sector, and do you think there will be a greater demand for these analytics tools if the rule is finalized?
Interesting. I guess I would separate them probably. I think there's going to be huge demand for these tools, period. I think investor demand, regardless of what the SEC does, I think is going to drive more and more companies to be adopting this. I mean, my goal, frankly, I was going to mention, we're a little bit, well, we're very competitive in my industry, and I'm even competitive on sustainability and even competitive on our Tcfd. So I like to think that I have the best Tcfd, but the audience should go check and see what you think. So I think that kind of competitive spirit, and as companies engage with investors, and investors are just going to this is going to become table stakes. Like you're going to have to try this, right? You got to get on the road. The SEC rule, I think there is something in that the SEC rule probably is going to drive more and more companies to have to seek outside help in getting all of their disclosures, making sure that all their disclosures are actually right. I think it's going to drive a lot of business for anybody who's engaged in assurance or audit, right? And it's, I think, going to drive a lot of interesting conversations about, in the end, the actual calculation of your emissions. I mean, there's so many different ways to do it. Yes, I mean, I understand that there's the greenhouse gas protocol, and there are accepted kind of ways of doing the calculations. But I mean, for example, we sell the emissions reductions from sustainable aviation fuel to our corporate customers, and they want to know, well, what's the emission reduction? Well, we've got 3 or 4 different ways you could calculate that. Like, we don't hand to people an emissions calculation. So I just think it's incredibly complicated. I'm not surprised it's taken the SEC this long, and I'm kind of glad that they're really taking the time to think about it. And so I think there will be whole markets springing up to help companies deal with this.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, thank you. And to wrap us up today, since we just have a few more minutes, we touched a little bit on this, but I'd love to hear any other comments you all may have. What advice would you have for companies who are new to assessing their physical risks and maybe concerned about how they will fare under different climate change scenarios? We talked about just diving in, just taking the first step is really important, but if there's anything else, it would be great to hear. Maybe we can start with Don this time.
Well, I'd like to paraphrase Herman Daly. Your company is a wholly owned subsidiary of the climate, not the other way around. And we don't have a choice at this point. So those of us who are in that climate, some are going to do well and some not so well. I would encourage you to lean in, get started, engage, find the path that helps you do well, help address the problem. Your customers will reward you for it. Your investors will reward you for it, and you'll feel better about it for your kids and your grandkids.
I would say start with a BAU scenario. I think, as Don said, like in the end, it may not matter so much. I mean, you want to pick a scenario that not necessarily worst case, but somewhere close to worst case. And it, one of the things I've learned today is that there are so many kind of relatively simple to use tools where, assuming you don't have 250,000 physical assets, and start with the assets that earn you the most revenue, and like start with your top 10 and go from there. And you'll learn a lot just by doing that.
I would totally, first of all, agree with those two set of thoughts, and then just very briefly add one consideration, and that is to consider this a strategic process. It's often a thought maybe as a more of a defensive one, but as we are seeing with Jill, there is a huge strategic value coming out of this, and the positive implications are there. It's not that every private actor will find opportunities associated to this, but we are entering a total new market, let's call it, an efficient market where goods and services for the protection of economic and human activity from physical climate risk are going to be predominant. So opportunities are going to be there, but yes, it's about starting the discussion, and we have had this with many actors within the coalition, that they start with a little bit of tell me just something about the very fundamental, and it's a progressive journey that needs to be worked step by step, but it is really worth from a strategic standpoint.
Excellent. Well, thank you so much, Don, Carlos, and Jill, for your time and insights. Thank you, everyone, for joining us today for our webinar. We welcome you to check out our report and new physical risk toolkit. You can find them on c2es.org. Thanks again, everyone. Have a great day.